They say kindness is a virtue. But what happens when kindness is mistaken for weakness? What happens when a good heart is thrown into a ruthless game where the only rule is, the one with the most power wins? Before we dive into this explosive story, grab a warm cup of coffee, sit back, and stay with us till the end, because what happens next will shock you. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to hit like, share, and subscribe. New York City, the land of billionaires and broken dreams. In the towering heights of the Mercer penthouse, a world of untouchable wealth and cold-blooded ambition unfolded. A world completely foreign to Elena Carter, a woman who had spent her entire life fighting to survive. Elena wasn't just another struggling worker. She was the kind of person who put others before herself, sacrificing sleep, comfort, and even her own future just to make sure her younger sister had a better life. She worked 2 jobs, cleaned up after people who didn't know her name, and believed deep down that kindness always came back in the end. But the world doesn't reward kindness. It preys on it. And no one knew how to prey on the weak better than Nathaniel Blackwood. A billionaire raised in privilege, Nathaniel had never known struggle. To him, money was power, and power meant control. He didn't ask for things. He took them. And when his closest friend, Marcus Langford, challenged his ego over a game of high-stakes poker, Nathaniel saw an opportunity for amusement. "You think money can't buy everything?" Marcus smirked, swirling his whiskey. "Prove it. Take a woman, any woman, someone who doesn't belong in our world, and turn her into a socialite in 3 months. Make her one of us. Make her love you. If you succeed, I'll wire $5 million into your account before the night ends." Nathaniel laughed. The bet was insultingly easy. Of course he could do it. He could make anyone love him. After all, love was just a well-crafted illusion. "Fine." Nathaniel leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Pick the woman. Let's make this interesting." Marcus scanned the room before his gaze landed on someone, Elena. She wasn't supposed to be part of this world. She was only there because one of the catering staff had called in sick. With her hair tied back in a messy ponytail, her uniform neat but simple, and her head bowed as she quietly refilled champagne glasses, she was invisible to everyone in that room, except now. Her, Marcus pointed with a sly grin. That one. The maid. The table erupted in laughter. Nathaniel arched an eyebrow, glancing at Elena. A challenge? Perhaps. But a challenge he would win. "Done," he said smoothly, lifting his glass. "Watch and learn, gentlemen." That was the night Elena's fate was sealed. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that the man who would soon offer her everything, who would look at her like she was the only woman in the world, who would whisper words of devotion and promise her a fairy tale, was only playing a game. Because in Nathaniel's world, love wasn't real. It was just another bet. But he forgot one thing. Even the kindest hearts have their limits. Even the weakest can learn to fight back. And when Elena finally learns the truth, she won't walk away quietly. Stay tuned, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. The car pulled up to the Blackwood mansion, its towering gates opening slowly, revealing a palace built on wealth and power. The sheer scale of it, massive stone pillars, fountains larger than city apartments, and a driveway that could fit an army, made Elena Carter feel like she had walked into a world where she didn't belong. But she was here now, because she had made a deal with the devil. Nathaniel Blackwood stepped out of the Rolls-Royce first, his tailored suit crisp, his expression unreadable. To him, this wasn't a life-changing moment. It was just another day, another contract signed, another piece of his game falling into place. Elena hesitated before stepping onto the pristine marble steps. She reminded herself why she agreed to this. Her sister, the hospital bills, the suffocating weight of survival. This wasn't about her. It never was. As she walked through the grand entrance, a row of maids and butlers stood waiting, their faces impassive, trained in the art of not reacting, except for one moment, one brief flicker of judgment in their eyes when they looked at her. Nathaniel barely acknowledged them. Instead, he walked ahead, expecting her to follow. Inside, the house was even colder than she imagined. No warmth, no family photos, just a museum of excess. At the foot of the grand staircase, A woman with sharp eyes and a posture so rigid it could cut glass stepped forward. "Mrs. Blackwood," she addressed Elena, though her tone was void of respect. "I am Evelyn Hart, the household manager. I will be overseeing your adjustment into your new role." Adjustment. The word felt like a warning. Before Elena could respond, Nathaniel spoke, his voice as smooth as glass, but just as unfeeling. "You will listen to everything Evelyn says. She will make sure you don't embarrass me." Elena's stomach tightened. "Embarrass you?" Nathaniel turned to her, finally looking her in the eyes. "This arrangement only works if you can play the part. No missteps, no emotions, just perfection." She wanted to scream, but instead she clenched her fists at her sides and nodded. Elena quickly learned that this was not a marriage, it was an assimilation. Each morning a team of stylists arrived before dawn. They examined her like she was a broken project in need of repair. "This shade doesn't suit her complexion," one would mutter. "Her posture needs work," another would sigh. She was told what to wear, how to sit, how to hold a glass, how to smile in a way that wasn't too eager, because desperation was unattractive. And Nathaniel? Nathaniel was never there. At events, he placed his hand lightly on her back, introduced her with the charm of a well-trained politician, smiled for the cameras. But the second they were alone, nothing. He would leave without a word, treating her presence in his life like an accessory, one that could be discarded the moment it lost its appeal. And the people in his world? They saw her exactly the same way. The Blackwood Annual Charity Gala was where it all fell apart. Elena had spent hours being transformed into someone she barely recognized. A silk gown worth more than her childhood home, diamonds that weren't hers, a mask of perfection painted onto her face, but nothing could prepare her for what was waiting. She felt their eyes on her the moment she stepped into the ballroom, the whispers, the laughter hidden behind champagne glasses. A woman in an emerald gown, Victoria Lancaster, one of Nathaniel's exes, smirked as she turned to her friend. "She cleans up well, doesn't she? For a girl who used to scrub floors?" Her friend replied with a cruel smile. Elena's fingers dug into the stem of her wine glass. She wanted to leave. But then, Nathaniel walked in. The whispers stopped, because he was the real power in the room. He greeted people with effortless ease, accepted praise with his usual smirk. He was untouchable. And then, Victoria touched his arm. "Nathaniel," she purred. "I can't believe you actually went through with it." He just smirked. "Did you doubt me?" The words weren't meant for Elena. They were meant for everyone else in that room. The message was clear. She was his project, his proof that he could turn anyone into something polished and presentable. Elena felt sick, and the worst part? Nathaniel didn't even look at her. Not once. That night, back at the mansion, Elena snapped. She stormed into his study, her hands shaking. "You let them humiliate me," she said, her voice raw. Nathaniel, seated behind his massive mahogany desk, didn't even flinch. He simply poured himself a drink, as if she were an insignificant inconvenience. "They were always going to talk," he said, sipping his whiskey. "Why should I care?" Elena's vision blurred with anger. "Because I am your wife. Or is that just another part of the illusion?" Finally, he met her gaze, and what she saw there. Cold amusement, mild interest, but no remorse, made something inside her shatter. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, standing up, walking toward her like a predator assessing its prey. "This was never about you. It was about proving a point." Elena took a step back, her stomach twisting. "A point?" Nathaniel smirked. "That I can turn anyone into what I need them to be." And that was it. That was the moment Elena Carter died. The Elena who believed people deserved second chances. The Elena who thought kindness could change even the coldest hearts. The Elena who thought she could endure this. That Elena was gone. The woman standing in front of Nathaniel was someone new, someone who would never be controlled again. She turned on her heel and walked out. Nathaniel didn't stop her, because he didn't realize yet, not yet, that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Because Elena Carter wasn't a doll to be dressed up. She was fire, and fire burns everything it touches. The Blackwood estate never looked more extravagant. Golden chandeliers cast a soft glow over the ballroom, illuminating a sea of perfectly tailored suits and glittering gowns. Waiters moved between the guests, pouring champagne into crystal glasses, their movements precise, effortless. The scent of expensive cologne and imported roses filled the air. Elena Carter stood near the bar, fingers lightly grazing the rim of her untouched drink. Her silk gown, a deep shade of midnight blue, clung to her figure, carefully chosen by Nathaniel's stylist. She had been given the best dress, the best jewelry, and a place by his side. On the surface, she had everything. But inside, she felt like a ghost in her own life. Nathaniel was across the room, surrounded by men who held power the way most people held oxygen, effortlessly, naturally, as if they had been born knowing the world would bow to them. Elena had long since learned that in Nathaniel's world, words mattered less than appearances. You didn't need to be genuine. You just needed to look the part. She was still learning how to play the game. But tonight, the game would end. Elena wasn't meant to overhear the conversation. She had only wandered toward the private lounge to escape the suffocating crowd, the endless smiles, the empty small talk. But as she stepped past the partially open door, one voice froze her in place. Marcus Langford, Nathaniel's closest friend. "You know, I have to admit I didn't think you'd actually pull it off," Marcus chuckled, swirling his whiskey. "I mean, turning a maid into a Blackwood? That's one hell of a trick." Elena felt the air leave her lungs. Inside the room, Nathaniel exhaled, his tone relaxed, unaffected. It was never a question of if. It was always a matter of how fast. 3 months, Marcus mused. And you've got her dressing the part, walking the part. Hell, she even looks at you like you hung the damn moon. Nathaniel's voice dropped lower. Because that's what people do when you give them something they never thought they could have. Laughter, glass clinking. Elena's vision blurred, her heartbeat a deafening roar in her ears. "So what's next?" another voice asked. "You keep her? Or does the illusion end when you get bored?" Nathaniel sighed, almost amused. People like her always fall in love. They think money is a miracle. They confuse luxury with affection. But in the end, she's just another project. A project. The word cut deeper than any insult ever could. Elena stepped back, the sound of laughter slicing through her like a blade, her hands clenched into fists. Every moment, every whispered promise, every touch, it had all been a lie. And yet, the worst part? She had believed it. She had let herself believe it. Elena didn't cry. She didn't tremble. Instead, she did the one thing Nathaniel never expected. She walked into the room. The laughter died instantly. Marcus set down his glass. The other men glanced at each other, and Nathaniel, for the first time in his life, he looked truly caught off guard. "Elena," he started, but she raised a hand, silencing him. The tension in the room thickened, an electric current humming between them. She could have screamed. She could have thrown her drink in his face, but that would mean he had won. So instead, she just looked at him. And when she spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, and deadly. "I trusted you." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "It's not what you think." She tilted her head, a bitter smile curling on her lips. "No? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like what I think." Silence, all eyes on her. She could feel the weight of their curiosity, the tension in the air as people waited to see if she would break. But she wouldn't give them the satisfaction. "I thought you were different, Nathaniel," she continued. "I thought maybe, just maybe, you saw me as something more than a game." Nathaniel stepped forward. "Elena, listen." "No." Her voice was sharper than a knife's edge. "You don't get to explain this away. You don't get to look at me with that same charming smile and expect me to forget." His expression hardened. "Then what do you want?" Elena exhaled, feeling the weight of her own naivety pressing against her ribs. And then finally she said the words she should have said a long time ago. "I want out. Gasps rippled through the room. Nathaniel's face turned to stone. "Be careful with your words, Elena." She stepped closer, meeting his gaze head on. "No, you be careful, Nathaniel. Because you just lost the one person who actually saw you for something other than your bank account." Silence. A silence so sharp it could have shattered glass. Then, without another word, Elena turned and walked out. She didn't run. She didn't break. And Nathaniel Blackwood? For the first time in his life, he had no control over the situation. No carefully crafted excuse. No power. Just the cold, sinking realization that he had lost her. What happens next? Now the question is, will Nathaniel fight for her? Or is Elena truly done with him? If you want to see what happens next, hit like, drop a comment below, and let us know. Does he deserve redemption? Or should she walk away forever? Don't miss the next chapter. Subscribe now so you don't miss the moment when Elena Carter finally takes back her power. The rain had started hours ago, soaking the city streets in a relentless downpour. The sky, once lined with stars, had vanished behind thick rolling clouds, almost as if the universe itself had turned its back on her. Elena Carter walked aimlessly, her heels clicking against the wet pavement. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to leave. She had walked out of the Blackwood estate with nothing but the dress on her back and the weight of a betrayal so deep it threatened to consume her whole. Nathaniel had played her. She had been nothing more than a bet, a temporary project for him to prove his control over the world. The way he had spoken about her, the amusement in his voice, it haunted her. Her vision blurred with unshed tears, but she refused to cry. Crying meant weakness. And Elena Carter had been weak for too long. A cheap motel. That was where she ended up, though she barely remembered how. The neon light outside flickered in and out, casting distorted shadows across the cracked walls. The room smelled of damp linen and cigarette smoke, a far cry from the polished, perfumed halls of the Blackwood mansion. Elena stood in front of the small mirror above the sink, gripping the edges of the counter as she forced herself to look. The woman staring back at her was unrecognizable. Her mascara had smudged beneath her eyes, dark streaks against pale skin. Strands of hair had fallen loose from the elegant updo she had worn earlier that evening, now a tangled mess around her shoulders. But it wasn't the ruined makeup or the disheveled hair that unsettled her. It was the emptiness in her eyes. She had spent months trying to fit into Nathaniel's world, shaping herself into someone worthy of him, someone worthy of his approval. But in the end, she had never been anything more than a game piece. Her fingers curled into fists, nails digging into her palms. How had she let this happen? How had she let him happen? Her chest tightened as the realization hit her like a tidal wave. It wasn't just him. It was her. She had allowed this. She had spent so much time trying to prove herself to a man who had never even seen her as a person. She had been silent when she should have spoken. She had been passive when she should have fought. She had believed in something that was never real. Her breath came faster, her pulse hammering in her ears. Then something shifted. The pain, the humiliation, twisted into something else. Something darker, something stronger. She straightened, her grip on the counter tightening. If she had been foolish enough to believe in Nathaniel Blackwood, then she would not make the same mistake again. She wouldn't break. She wouldn't beg. And she sure as hell wouldn't disappear. Number. If Nathaniel thought he had won, if he thought she would simply vanish like an abandoned project, he was wrong. Elena Carter was done being a game piece. If she had to burn down everything he thought he knew about her to prove it, then so be it. She left the motel hours before dawn, the streets still damp from the night's storm. The world around her was eerily quiet, but inside, she had never felt louder. Her thoughts weren't clouded anymore. The confusion, the heartbreak, they had burned away. Now all that remained was clarity. She wasn't going back to her old life. That version of her was dead the moment she had walked into the Blackwood estate, blind to the fact that she had stepped onto a battlefield disguised as a palace. But she also wasn't the woman who had stood frozen in that ballroom, humiliated, betrayed. That woman was gone too. Elena had one person left in this world, her sister, the only family she had, the one she had fought for before she had gotten lost in Nathaniel's lies. She took out her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. It had been months since she had called. She had allowed herself to be consumed by a world that had never been hers, and in doing so, she had forgotten the one person who had always mattered. Not anymore. She pressed dial. The phone rang twice before a tired voice picked up. "Hello?" Elena's throat tightened. "Sophia." There was a long pause. "Elena?" Her sister's voice held equal parts disbelief and relief. "Where are you? What happened? Are you okay?" For a moment, Elena considered lying, saying she was fine, that nothing had changed. But no, she was done lying. "I messed up, Soph. I lost myself for a while." She exhaled, her voice steadier now. "But I'm back." Another pause, then a soft chuckle. "Well, it's about damn time." Elena smiled for the first time that night. Because, yes, it was about damn time. The city was still asleep, but Elena was wide awake. She walked with purpose now, her steps lighter, stronger. There was no plan, no mapped-out future, but there was determination. And that was enough. Nathaniel Blackwood had taken a woman who had once believed in kindness, in love, in second chances, and he had turned her into something else. Not a broken victim, not a weak, discarded plaything, but a force. Because when people like him made the mistake of thinking kindness was weakness, they always underestimated what happened when the people they broke learned how to fight back. Elena Carter had learned, and the next time she faced Nathaniel Blackwood, she wouldn't be the one walking away. They thought she would stay broken, that she would never rise from the wreckage. But they forgot one thing: when a woman decides to rebuild herself, she becomes unstoppable. If you've ever had to start over, comment 1 below. And if you're ready to see what happens next, subscribe, because this story is just getting started. The city stretched out before her, vast and indifferent. Elena Carter stood at the edge of the sidewalk, watching the sunrise stain the sky with shades of gold and crimson. The air was crisp, fresh, the kind of morning that whispered of new beginnings. It had been 2 weeks since she had walked away from Nathaniel Blackwood. 2 weeks of silence. 2 weeks of finding herself in the wreckage he left behind. The first few nights were the hardest. She had rented a tiny apartment, nothing like the Blackwood estate, but it was hers. The walls were bare, the mattress thin, but she had never felt more at home. No rules, no expectations, no one telling her what she should be. For the first time in her life, she was free. But freedom wasn't enough, because freedom meant nothing if she didn't know what to do with it. Elena needed a job. She refused to touch the money Nathaniel had given her. Every dollar felt tainted, a reminder of what she had allowed herself to become. So she started small. A waitress position at a downtown cafe. Long hours, low pay. But she didn't care. She wiped down tables, took orders, and kept her head high. Because this time she wasn't working just to survive. She was building something. And that meant learning. Every spare moment was spent devouring books on business, negotiation, and financial independence. She enrolled in evening classes, sitting in the back of a dimly lit lecture hall, absorbing everything she had never been given the chance to learn. Economics, marketing, contracts, all the things men like Nathaniel used to control the world. But now she would use them to take control of her own life. She refused to be anyone's project ever again. Months passed. The bruises on her pride had healed. And the woman staring back at her in the mirror, she was different. Her posture was straighter, her eyes sharper. She no longer dressed for someone else's approval. Her wardrobe was no longer a costume for a role she was forced to play. Everything she owned, everything she was hers. And it was in that moment, staring at her reflection, that she realized something profound. She no longer craved love. She craved respect, not from others, from herself. The first time she stepped into a business negotiation, the men in the room barely acknowledged her. They assumed she was someone's assistant, until she opened her mouth, until she spoke their language, until she countered their offers, read between the lines of their contracts, and played the game they never expected her to know. By the time she walked out of that boardroom, they weren't just looking at her. They were listening. Because Elena Carter wasn't a pawn anymore. She was a contender, and she was just getting started. The invitation arrived in a thick, cream-colored envelope. The Blackwood Annual Gala. The very place where her humiliation had begun. She could have ignored it, but that wasn't who she was anymore, so she went, not as a guest, not as an accessory, but as someone who belonged. She entered the ballroom in a sleek, tailored dress, not a gift from a man, but something she had bought with her own money. The whispers started immediately. The last time they had seen her, she had been a girl walking away in disgrace. Now she was untouchable. She felt their stares. She let them watch. Because she wasn't here for them. She was here for him. Nathaniel Blackwood stood at the far end of the room, a glass of whiskey in hand. The second their eyes met, something shifted in his expression. Not amusement. Not arrogance. Something closer to regret. He approached slowly, as if testing the air between them. "You came," he murmured. Elena lifted a brow. "Did you think I wouldn't?" Nathaniel exhaled, tilting his head. "You look different." "I am." A pause. "I never expected you to disappear," he admitted. She smirked. "That was your first mistake." Another silence. She could see the shift in him, the realization that he had miscalculated, that the woman standing in front of him was no longer the girl he had molded. "What do you want, Elena?" he asked finally. She took a step closer, her voice quiet but sharp. "Nothing." And that was the moment Nathaniel Blackwood finally understood. He had lost her. Not because she hated him, not because she wanted revenge, but because she no longer needed him. She turned, walking away without another word. And this time, he was the one left watching. Elena Carter had started over. She had built herself from nothing, and now she was unstoppable, not because she had found someone to love her, but because she had finally learned to love herself. And that was more powerful than anything Nathaniel Blackwood had ever known. He thought she would break. He thought she would beg, but he never expected this. What happens when a man who has everything suddenly realizes he's lost the only thing that ever mattered? Nathaniel Blackwood had always been a man of certainty. He had built his empire with precision, dominated every boardroom with an iron grip, and navigated life like a game of chess, where he was always 5 steps ahead. And yet, as he sat in his penthouse office, staring blankly at the untouched glass of whiskey on his desk, for the first time he didn't know what move to make. Elena was gone. Not just physically. She had erased herself from his world. At first, he thought it was temporary, that she needed time, that she would come back. But days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into something worse. Silence. Nathaniel Blackwood had always been able to predict the actions of others, but he never expected her to disappear like this. He tried to move on, tried to convince himself that nothing had changed, that losing Elena was just another business transaction that had run its course. But nothing felt the same. The penthouse, once a symbol of power, felt cold and lifeless. The whiskey he once savored burned bitterly down his throat. Even the women, beautiful, sophisticated, flawless, meant nothing. They weren't her. They didn't challenge him, didn't see through him, didn't make him question who he really was. For the first time, Nathaniel Blackwood, the man who controlled everything, had lost control. He wasn't looking for her. At least, that's what he told himself. But one evening, scrolling through the latest business reports, he saw her. A candid photo. Elena Carter, standing outside a high-profile finance summit. Her posture, effortless. Her expression, calm. Her presence, commanding. She wasn't broken. She wasn't hiding. She wasn't waiting for him. She was thriving. And worse, she looked free. Nathaniel's grip on his phone tightened as a bitter realization settled in. She had walked away from him, and she had never looked back. He saw her again by accident, or maybe fate had a cruel sense of humor. It was at an exclusive gala, a place where power gathered in the form of tailored suits and whispered deals. Nathaniel had barely been listening to the conversations around him when he noticed the shift in the room, a ripple of attention, a pause in conversation. And then, she walked in. Elena Carter, but not the woman he had known. No hesitation, no uncertainty, no lingering remnants of the girl who had once looked at him with hope. She moved through the crowd as if she had always belonged. And the worst part? People noticed her. Not as his former lover, not as a woman attached to his name, but as someone powerful in her own right. Nathaniel Blackwood was used to being the most important person in the room. But at that moment, she stole the air from his lungs. And then, she saw him. For the first time in weeks, their eyes met. But she didn't falter, didn't hesitate, didn't break. She simply looked at him, and then she smirked. Not in the way she used to, when she was amused by his arrogance. This was different. This was a declaration. She wasn't the same, she wasn't afraid, and she wasn't his. Nathaniel took a step toward her, instinct kicking in. But before he could say a word, she turned away, without hesitation, without acknowledgement. Without him, Nathaniel's world tilted. He had expected her to break, had expected her to struggle, had expected her to wait for him. He had never expected her to outgrow him. And yet, here she was, unaffected, untouchable, unfinished. And for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Blackwood felt fear. Nathaniel never lost. But this was different. He could rebuild companies, could recover from financial losses, could buy anything he wanted. But Elena Carter was not for sale. And the worst part, she had been right all along. You think I would fall apart? Her voice echoed in his mind, haunting him. No, Nathaniel. I'm just getting started. And this time, she wasn't looking back. Nathaniel Blackwood wasn't a man who begged, but he found himself wanting to, because it wasn't just losing her that hurt. It was knowing she had won. She had built herself from nothing. She had made something of herself, without him. And Nathaniel? He was still the same, still the man with all the power in the world, and absolutely nothing that mattered. He found himself watching her from a distance. A press conference, a business deal, a speech she gave at an event he hadn't even known she was attending. She was everywhere, and each time she never saw him, because he didn't exist in her world anymore. Nathaniel had become irrelevant, and that was worse than hatred, worse than rejection. It was oblivion. Weeks passed. Nathaniel Blackwood was a man who didn't lose, and yet, every time he saw her, every time he heard her name, every time someone mentioned her success, it felt like another defeat. And then, the invitation arrived, not from her, from an associate, a charity event, one he knew she would be at. Nathaniel stared at the invitation for a long time. He had power, he had influence, he had resources. But the one thing he didn't have? Her. And this time, he had no idea if he ever would again. Nathaniel Blackwood had never feared losing anything, but now, he feared never being able to win her back. And for the first time in his life, he had no plan. He thought an apology would be enough. He thought she was the same woman he once controlled, but when he came back, he found out the truth. She had outgrown him. If you've ever had someone try to walk back into your life like nothing happened, comment 2 below. Nathaniel Blackwood had never been a man who looked back. He built his world on control, power, and certainty, but Elena Carter had shattered all of it. For weeks, he told himself he didn't care, that she was just a phase, that he would move on, that she would come back. But she didn't. And now, he was here. Standing outside a quiet cafe in a part of town he had never once set foot in, staring through the glass window like a man who had lost his way. Inside, she was laughing, not the forced, polite smile she had worn in his world, not the silent, hesitant look she used to give him when she still believed in him. This was real. She was free, and he had no idea how to reach her anymore, but he had to try. The second he walked through the door, the energy in the room shifted. The warmth, the light-hearted atmosphere, it froze. Elena didn't have to turn around to know he was there. She felt it, like a cold shadow pressing against her spine. And when she finally looked up, there was no surprise in her eyes. Just calm, just silence, just distance. Nathaniel took a slow breath. Elena. She tilted her head, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. You found me. Congratulations. Her voice was steady. No fear, no hesitation, and no warmth. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel Blackwood was the one standing on uncertain ground. "Can we talk?" His voice was lower now, almost careful. Elena studied him, amusement flickering in her eyes. "Talk?" She set her cup down and leaned forward slightly. "Now you want to talk?" Nathaniel clenched his jaw. He had prepared for this, or at least he thought he had. "I was wrong." His voice was firm, controlled. The same voice that had won over investors, closed deals, commanded boardrooms. But she wasn't his audience anymore, and she wasn't impressed. "Wrong?" Elena repeated, amusement turning into something sharper. She leaned back, crossing her arms. "Tell me, Nathaniel, which part were you wrong about? Was it the part where you treated me like a game? The part where you thought I was replaceable, or the part where you assumed I would fall apart without you?" Every word landed like a dagger, and Nathaniel, for the first time in his life, had no defense, because she was right. He had believed all of that, but what he hadn't expected, what he had never prepared for, was the reality in front of him now. She wasn't broken. She wasn't waiting. She didn't need him. And that terrified him. "Elena." He exhaled, frustration creeping into his voice. "I didn't come here to fight." She raised a brow. "No? Then what did you come here for?" Nathaniel hesitated, and for the first time he didn't know how to answer. Because what did he want? Her forgiveness? Her trust? A second chance? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that the thought of never seeing her again was unbearable. He ran a hand through his hair, sighing. "I just need you to understand, I made a mistake." Elena stared at him for a long moment, and then she laughed. Not the kind of laugh that warmed a room. Not the kind of laugh that meant she was amused. This was cold. This was cutting. This was the sound of a woman who had finally outgrown him. "You think this is about a mistake?" She shook her head, disbelief in her voice. "Nathaniel, you didn't make a mistake. You made a choice." Her eyes locked onto his, unwavering. "You chose to treat me like nothing. You chose to gamble with my life. And now you want to stand here and act like an apology is enough?" Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat, because she wasn't just rejecting his apology. She was rejecting him. Nathaniel swallowed. "I want a chance to prove that I—" "Prove?" Elena cut him off, tilting her head. Then she leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table, her voice softer now. "And tell me, Nathaniel, why would I ever let you?" Silence. He had no answer, because deep down, he knew the truth. She didn't owe him anything. Not her time, not her attention, and certainly not a second chance. Nathaniel Blackwood was a man who had spent his entire life getting what he wanted, but for the first time, he was powerless, because Elena Carter was no longer his to win. She stood up, tossing a few bills onto the table before grabbing her coat. Before she walked past him, she paused, just for a second. And then, she looked him straight in the eye, and with a quiet, unwavering voice, she said the words that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "You think I would fall apart?" She let the silence stretch, a slow smirk forming on her lips. "No, Nathaniel, I'm just getting started." And then, she walked away. Not with hesitation, not with regret, but with certainty. Nathaniel Blackwood remained frozen in place, watching her disappear into the city, the world moving around him while he stood still. And for the first time, he truly understood what it meant to lose. Nathaniel Blackwood had spent his entire life believing that power could fix anything. Money solved problems. Money built legacies. Money erased mistakes. But this time, money wasn't enough. He had expected Elena to push him away. He had expected her to make him work for her trust. But he hadn't expected this. She sat across from him, her expression unreadable, her presence sharper than he remembered. "If you think I'll take you back because you said you're sorry," she said calmly, "you don't know me at all." Nathaniel swallowed. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, rehearsing every possible conversation in his mind. Yet here she was, stripping his confidence away in seconds. "Then tell me what I need to do," he said finally, voice controlled but edged with frustration. Elena leaned back, crossing her arms. "I don't want an apology, Nathaniel." Her next words landed like a blade to his chest. "I want to see if you can actually become someone worth my time." Nathaniel inhaled slowly. "And how exactly do I prove that?" She studied him for a long moment, as if weighing the very essence of his soul. Then, with quiet precision, she spoke. "You have all this power, all this money, and you've never used it for anything except yourself." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You want a chance?" She tilted her head. "Then do something that actually matters." Nathaniel narrowed his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about people who don't have a tenth of what you take for granted." She leaned forward, holding his gaze. "If you really want to prove you've changed, use what you have to help others, not just yourself." Nathaniel stiffened. This was not what he had expected. Not at all. "You want me to give money away?" Elena scoffed. "No, Nathaniel. I want you to actually do something. I want you to get your hands dirty, to step into a world you've spent your life ignoring." She stood up, grabbing her coat. "Until then?" She glanced at him over her shoulder. "You're just the same man you've always been." And then she walked away. Again. Leaving him with a challenge he had no idea how to face. Nathaniel Blackwood had never stepped into a world that didn't revolve around him. But now? Now he was standing in a rundown community center on the south side of the city, completely out of place. The air smelled like old books and fresh coffee, voices echoing through the halls, children laughing, volunteers discussing logistics. It was loud, unorganized, and nothing like the polished world he was used to. "You lost?" Nathaniel turned toward the voice. A woman stood near the entrance, arms crossed, looking him up and down like she was trying to figure out why a billionaire had wandered into a charity event. "I'm looking for Elena Carter," he said. The woman raised a brow. "And what does Mr. Blackwood want with Elena Carter?" Nathaniel hesitated. "She told me to come here." The woman smirked. "Did she now?" She gestured toward the main hall. "Then you'd better get to work." Nathaniel hadn't done manual labor in years, but here he was, sleeves rolled up, helping set up tables for a fundraising dinner. It was humiliating, it was exhausting, and worst of all, no one cared who he was. No one rushed to serve him, no one tried to impress him, no one looked at him with fear or admiration. To them, he was just another set of hands, and somehow that made this harder than any deal he had ever closed. But when Elena finally walked in, seeing him standing there, covered in dust, surrounded by volunteers, she didn't look impressed. She looked amused. "You're still here?" she asked, crossing her arms. Nathaniel wiped his hands on a napkin. "You told me to prove myself, didn't you?" She gave him a slow, assessing look. "And what exactly have you proven, Nathaniel?" The words stung more than they should have. He clenched his jaw. "I showed up." She nodded. "Good. Now let's see if you stay." Nathaniel returned the next day, and the next, and the next. At first he treated it like a business deal, a problem to be solved. But then something changed. He started talking to people, hearing their stories, understanding struggles he had never even considered. The single mother working 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. The teenage boy trying to escape the cycle of crime in his neighborhood. The elderly woman who had lost her home because of a medical bill she couldn't afford. Nathaniel Blackwood had spent his life surrounded by wealth, and now, for the first time, he saw the other side, and he didn't know how to reconcile the two worlds. Weeks passed. Elena watched from a distance. She had expected him to quit, had expected him to get frustrated, to walk away when things got uncomfortable. But he didn't. She saw him struggle, saw him fail. But more importantly, she saw him keep going. One evening, as the event wrapped up, she finally approached him. "You lasted longer than I thought," she admitted. Nathaniel smirked, leaning against a chair. "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." Elena chuckled softly. "Don't get used to it." A pause. Then, quieter. "Why are you really here, Nathaniel?" He met her gaze, and for once, he had no carefully crafted answer. "Because you asked me to be." Elena exhaled slowly, shaking her head. "That's not enough." Nathaniel straightened. "Then tell me what is." She studied him for a moment, searching his face for something. Then, with quiet finality, she said, "When you stop doing this for me, and start doing it for yourself." And with that, she walked away, leaving him with the one question he had never asked himself before. Who was he if he wasn't doing this for her? And for the first time, Nathaniel Blackwood didn't know the answer. He built an empire. He controlled everything. But for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Blackwood was doing something not for power, not for profit, but because he had to prove to himself that he was more than the man he used to be. Do you think people can truly change? Comment 1 if you believe in redemption, or 0 if you think some people never change. Nathaniel Blackwood had spent his life bending the world to his will. He had built an empire of steel and glass, shaped deals with an iron fist, and walked through life as if he were untouchable. But for the first time, he had lost. Not a business deal. Not money. Something far worse. He had lost himself. And she had been the one to show him that. Elena Carter had walked away not because she hated him, but because he wasn't worth staying for. And that truth burned more than any failure he had ever faced. For weeks, Nathaniel had been haunted by her last words. "I don't want an apology, Nathaniel. I want to see if you can actually become someone worth my time." They followed him everywhere. Into the boardrooms. Into the endless nights staring at the city skyline. Into the silence of an empty penthouse that once felt like a kingdom and now felt like a prison. He had spent his entire life thinking money was the answer to everything. But what if this was the one thing money couldn't buy? And for the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do. Nathaniel found himself standing outside the same community center Elena had taken him to weeks ago. He hadn't been invited. He hadn't been expected. Yet here he was. He exhaled sharply before stepping inside. The same woman who had greeted him last time, Cassie, one of the coordinators, raised an eyebrow at him. "Back again?" she asked, arms crossed. Nathaniel nodded. "I want to help." Cassie studied him for a moment before smirking. "Let me guess, you're not here to just write a check?" Nathaniel clenched his jaw. "No." Cassie's smirk widened. "Good, because we need real work, not rich men looking for a guilt cleanse." She tossed him an apron. "Let's see if you can keep up." And just like that, the real test began. Nathaniel Blackwood had closed billion-dollar deals. He had negotiated with world leaders. He had shaped industries. But now he was stacking boxes in a food bank. It was humiliating. It was exhausting. And worst of all, no one cared who he was. To them, he was just another volunteer. Just another pair of hands moving crates, unloading shipments, serving meals. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't in control. The first few days were brutal. His muscles ached from work he had never done before. His expensive shoes were ruined with dirt, and he hated the way people barely acknowledged him. But one night, everything changed. He had stayed late helping clean up when he heard a quiet voice from the corner of the room. A young boy, no older than 10, was sitting with his mother, sharing a meal. Nathaniel didn't know why he stopped to watch. Maybe because the boy reminded him of someone. Maybe because for the first time he wasn't thinking about himself. He caught bits of their conversation. "Mom, do we have to leave after this?" The woman hesitated, forcing a smile. "Not yet, sweetheart. Just eat first." Nathaniel knew that tone. It was the sound of someone pretending everything was okay, when it wasn't. He had heard it before, not from a stranger, but from his own mother. And in that moment, something inside him cracked. Nathaniel didn't just keep coming back. He started paying attention. He asked questions, listened to stories, understood for the first time why these places existed. And something terrifying happened. He started to care. He didn't just unload shipments anymore. He started using his resources. He helped the food bank secure long-term funding. He arranged employment programs for struggling families. He gave people the opportunities he had once taken for granted. Not for a press release, not for recognition, but because for the first time, he wanted to. Elena had been watching from a distance. She had expected him to quit, had expected him to grow frustrated and walk away when things got hard. But he hadn't. Weeks turned into months, and Nathaniel Blackwood, the man who once thought the world revolved around him, was no longer that man. One evening, after an event, she finally approached him. "So, you're still here?" Nathaniel smirked. "That's the nicest thing you've ever said to me." Elena chuckled. "Don't get used to it." A pause, then softer. "Why are you really here, Nathaniel?" He met her gaze, and for the first time he didn't have a rehearsed answer. "Because it's the right thing to do." Elena exhaled slowly. For the first time since she had walked away, she saw something real in his eyes. Not arrogance, not entitlement, not manipulation, but growth. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but for the first time she wondered if she ever could. Nathaniel Blackwood had lost everything that mattered, but for the first time in his life, he was becoming a man who didn't just take. He was becoming a man who gave, and this time he wasn't doing it for her, he was doing it for himself. He says he's changed. He wants her to believe it, but trust isn't given, it's earned. And after everything he did, why should she ever trust him again? Elena Carter had once believed in fairy tales. She had once believed that love could conquer all, that people could change, that deep down everyone had a heart. But Nathaniel Blackwood had taught her otherwise. He had taught her that love could be used as a game, that trust could be shattered in an instant, that some men didn't care who they hurt, as long as they won, and now, after everything, he expected her to believe he had changed? She wasn't that foolish girl anymore. Elena hadn't spoken to Nathaniel in months, but that didn't mean she didn't see him. She saw him in the headlines, not in the business section where he had once dominated, but in places she never expected to see his name. Charity events, community programs, funding initiatives for people who had once meant nothing to him. And worst of all, he wasn't making a spectacle out of it. There were no grand press releases, no cameras, no attempt to turn his redemption into a PR stunt. He was just there, showing up, day after day, week after week, with no expectation of anything in return. And that scared her more than anything else. Because what if he really had changed? What if, for the first time in his life, he wasn't doing this for himself? She told herself she wouldn't go, that it wasn't her problem, that whatever Nathaniel Blackwood did with his life now had nothing to do with her. But that night, as she walked past the community center, she saw him, alone, sitting on the front steps, staring at the city skyline. The Nathaniel she had known would have been at a gala tonight. He would have been in a penthouse, drinking whiskey, celebrating another business conquest. But this man looked lost, and before she could stop herself, she walked toward him. "You've been busy." Her voice was sharp. Nathaniel turned his head. When he saw her, something flickered in his eyes, something raw. "You could say that," he murmured. Elena crossed her arms. "Why?" He sighed. "Why what?" She tilted her head. "Why are you really doing this?" A long pause. Then, "Because it's the right thing to do." She scoffed. "That's not an answer, Nathaniel, not from you." He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Then tell me, what answer would make you believe me?" Elena studied him. He looked different. Not in the way he dressed, not in the way he carried himself, but in the way he wasn't trying to win anymore, and for a moment, she almost believed him. But then, she remembered. The lies, the bet, the months of being nothing more than an experiment to him. And just like that, the anger returned. "You've changed," she admitted, voice measured. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "But you don't trust me." Her lips pressed into a thin line. I don't." Silence. Then, to her surprise, a quiet, resigned nod. "I don't blame you." That threw her off. She had expected him to argue, to fight for her trust, to try and convince her that she owed him a chance. But he didn't. Instead, he just accepted it. And that scared her. because the Nathaniel Blackwood she had known would have never done that. Days passed, weeks, and still he was there, still working, still helping, still showing up, even when she wasn't watching. And that was what made Elena pause, because men like Nathaniel never did anything without a reason. And yet this time, it felt real. One night after an event, she found him standing outside. He looked tired, more than tired, worn. She stood beside him. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Then, "You know this doesn't change what happened, right?" Nathaniel didn't flinch. "I know." She turned to face him. "You hurt me, Nathaniel, more than you'll ever understand." His jaw clenched. "I know. And just because you're trying to be a better man now, doesn't mean I owe you anything." Nathaniel met her gaze. "I know." A pause. Then, softer. "I'm not doing this for you, Elena." She narrowed her eyes. "Then why?" A long silence. Then finally, "Because I hated the man I used to be." Elena inhaled sharply. She searched his face, looking for a lie, a manipulation, anything to prove that this was just another one of his games. But she found nothing. For the first time, he wasn't lying. And that scared her more than anything else. Elena Carter had always believed in second chances, but some wounds weren't so easily healed. Nathaniel Blackwood was no longer the man she once knew, but that didn't mean she could forget. And trust? Trust wasn't something that could be earned overnight. So, as she turned to leave, she gave him one last look. "Keep going, Nathaniel." Then quieter. "Maybe one day I'll believe you." And with that, she walked away. But this time he didn't chase her, because he finally understood that she owed him nothing. And if he truly wanted redemption, he would have to keep proving it, even if she never came back. Some men give up when they lose. Others fight until they prove they were never the men they once were. The question is, will she ever believe him? Nathaniel Blackwood had once been the kind of man who never had to prove himself to anyone. People feared him, respected him, did whatever he wanted without question. But Elena Carter, she wasn't like them. She wasn't impressed by his money. She wasn't blinded by his apologies. And she sure as hell wasn't going to let him back into her life just because he wanted it. If he wanted to be in her world, he had to earn it. Not with words, but with actions. Nathaniel didn't chase her. He didn't beg. He didn't try to convince her of anything. Instead, he just kept showing up, not in her life, but in the places that actually mattered. He continued working at the community center, continued investing in shelters, education programs, and job training initiatives. Continued doing the work, even when no one was watching, because this wasn't about Elena anymore. It was about who he was becoming. One afternoon, Elena found herself at a charity event, not because of him, not because she wanted to see him, but because she had spent years fighting for these causes, long before Nathaniel Blackwood ever decided to care. So when she saw him across the room, speaking with volunteers, helping coordinate donations, actually engaging with people in ways he never had before, she didn't know what to think. This wasn't a performance. This wasn't the Nathaniel she remembered. And for the first time, that terrified her. Elena didn't plan to talk to him, but somehow their paths crossed anyway. "You're still here," she said, arms crossed. Nathaniel turned, meeting her gaze. "So are you." Elena's eyes narrowed. "You know you don't have to do this anymore, right?" "I already told you, I don't trust you." Nathaniel nodded. "I know." A pause. "So why are you still here?" she asked, voice sharp. Nathaniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Because trust isn't something you ask for, Elena. It's something you prove." She wasn't expecting that. She wasn't expecting him to understand. And that made it even harder, because now she couldn't pretend that he was just another liar trying to win her back. Days passed. Weeks. Elena didn't let him in, but she watched. She saw the way he treated people, saw how he didn't use his wealth to control, but to uplift, saw how he listened, not because he was trying to manipulate, but because he actually cared. And slowly, so painfully slowly, her walls began to crack. But this time, She was the one in control. This wasn't like before. She wasn't the pawn in his game anymore. She was the one making the rules. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand confession, no earth-shattering revelation. It was simple, a rainy afternoon. Nathaniel was finishing a meeting when Elena walked up beside him, holding an umbrella. "You're going to get soaked," she said, not looking at him. Nathaniel blinked. "I'll survive." A long pause, then softer. "I know." And without another word, she held the umbrella over both of them, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Nathaniel didn't say anything, because he knew that this meant more than any apology ever could. Nathaniel had spent his entire life trying to control everything: business, people, his own emotions. But with Elena, he had finally learned that he couldn't control what mattered most, and instead of fighting it, he accepted it, because if she ever let him back into her life, it wouldn't be because he forced her. It would be because she chose to. One night, Elena stood in front of the old mansion she once lived in. It felt like another lifetime, like another version of herself had walked these halls, a version of herself who had believed in a love that never existed. She was about to leave when Nathaniel stepped outside. "I didn't think I'd see you here," he said quietly. Elena took a slow breath. "Neither did I." Nathaniel studied her. "Are you here for answers?" Elena shook her head. "Number, I already have them." A pause. "Then why?" She exhaled. "Because I needed to see if I still felt like the woman who walked away that night." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "And do you?" She held his gaze. "Number, I don't." And for the first time, she saw relief in his eyes, not because she was coming back, but because he knew, deep down, she had won. Elena Carter wasn't the same woman Nathaniel had fallen for. She wasn't the woman who had begged for love. She wasn't the woman who had been used as part of a game. She was stronger, smarter, unbreakable, and if Nathaniel wanted to be a part of her world again, it wouldn't be because she needed him. It would be because she chose him, on her terms. Do you think Elena should give Nathaniel another chance, or should she walk away forever? Comment below with your thoughts. And if you want to see what happens next, hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for the next part. Nathaniel Blackwood had built an empire on control. For years, everything in his life had been dictated by strategy, by power, by an unshakable belief that nothing was ever truly out of his grasp. Until Elena Carter. Until she walked away. Until she refused to be his pawn. Until she became the first thing in his life he couldn't manipulate, buy, or win. And now? Now she was standing in front of him, staring at him with those sharp, unwavering eyes. And for the first time, he had no idea what she was going to say next. "I've seen what you've been doing." Her voice was calm, controlled. "I know you've changed." Nathaniel remained silent, waiting. Elena took a slow breath, her expression unreadable. "But knowing that doesn't mean I've forgotten what you did." His jaw tightened. He had expected that. "I'm not asking you to forget." "Good." She crossed her arms. "Because I won't." Silence stretched between them. Nathaniel felt his chest tighten, but he didn't argue, because she was right. She had always been right. "Nathaniel, I'm not going to pretend that what you did didn't hurt me, that it didn't change me. I know. And I'm not coming back to you just because you regret it." Nathaniel swallowed. "Then why are you here?" Elena looked him dead in the eyes. "Because I need you to understand something." She stepped forward, closing the space between them just enough for him to feel the weight of her words. "If I choose to be with you, it won't be because I need you. It won't be because I can't live without you. It'll be because I want to. And that means you have to keep proving that you deserve me." A pause. "Not just today, not just tomorrow, but always." Nathaniel exhaled slowly. For a man who had always taken what he wanted, this was the hardest thing he had ever done. To wait. To accept that she owed him nothing. To know that no matter what he did, she could still walk away. "And if I do?" he asked quietly. Elena studied him for a long moment before answering. "Then maybe, one day, I'll believe that you're worth my love." Nathaniel nodded. because for the first time in his life he understood. Love wasn't something to be conquered. It wasn't a game to be won. It was a choice. And this time, it wasn't his to make. Elena Carter's journey isn't just a love story. It's a lesson in self-worth, boundaries, and the power of walking away when respect is no longer given. It's about finding strength in heartbreak, about turning pain into power, and about learning that real love isn't about possession, it's about choice. Her story resonates because at some point we've all been there. We've trusted the wrong people. We've ignored red flags. We've given chances to people who didn't deserve them. And when we finally realized the truth, that someone wasn't valuing us the way we deserved, we had to make a choice. Do we lower our standards and accept their excuses? Or do we stand our ground and demand more? Elena's choice was clear. She walked away. She didn't stay and wait for Nathaniel to realize her worth. She didn't beg him to change. She didn't try to prove to him that she was worthy of love, because she already knew she was. And that is where true power lies. Elena's story isn't just about romance. It's about every single relationship we have in life. Romantic, professional, even family and friendships. Think about it. How often do we give too much to people who don't appreciate us? How many times have we let things slide just to avoid confrontation? How many situations have we stayed in too long, hoping things would get better, even when deep down we knew they wouldn't? We teach people how to treat us by what we tolerate. If someone disrespects you once and you forgive them without consequence, they'll do it again. If someone takes you for granted and you continue to give them everything, they won't suddenly start appreciating you. If someone lies, cheats, or manipulates, and you excuse it, you're telling them that it's okay. Elena refused to play that game. She made it clear, if you betray me, you lose me. And when Nathaniel finally came back, she didn't hand him a second chance on a silver platter. She made him earn it. And that is the lesson. Nathaniel learned something that many people never do. Regret is easy. Change is hard. Anyone can say, I'm sorry. Anyone can say, I've changed. Anyone can make promises when they're afraid of losing you. But actions always tell the truth. Elena didn't take him back just because he apologized. She didn't believe him just because he said he was different. She made him prove it, and not just once, not just for a few weeks, not just when it was convenient, but over time, through real effort, through consistent actions that showed he wasn't the same man anymore. That's what real trust is built on. Not words, not guilt, not promises made in the heat of the moment, but proof. And in the end, Nathaniel understood something he never had before. Love isn't about ownership, control, or winning. It's about earning someone's trust and proving every single day that you deserve to be in their life. Elena wasn't cruel. She wasn't vengeful. She didn't punish Nathaniel for his mistakes. But she also didn't make it easy for him. She made him meet her where she stood, as an equal. And that's something we should all take to heart. If someone wants a place in your life, they need to be worthy of it. You don't beg for love. You don't chase people who walked away. You don't lower your standards because you're afraid of being alone. Instead, you stand firm. You say, if you want to be in my life, prove that you belong here. And if they do, then maybe, just maybe, they deserve another chance. Elena Carter's story makes us ask ourselves hard questions. Have you ever given someone a second chance when they didn't deserve it? Have you ever let someone come back into your life too easily? Have you ever mistaken an apology for real change? And most importantly, are you setting the standard for how you deserve to be treated? If not, maybe it's time to do what Elena did, walk away. And if they truly care, they'll show you, because love, real love, isn't about who misses you when you're gone. It's about who respects you enough to fight for you while you're still there. What do you think? Did Elena make the right decision? Should Nathaniel have been given another chance, or should she have walked away for good? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you loved this story, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Turn on notifications, because the next episode might just change the way you see love, trust, and second chances forever. See you in the next one.